The city of Arras in northern France witnessed some of the heaviest fighting in the last 2 years of the war. It is today perhaps a forgotten battlefield. What can we find of Arras in a day? In this episode, we return to our Battlefields in a Day podcasts, where we take a particular area of First World War battlefield and we look at it and see what we can find of it in a single day's travelling around that area. Now, it's impossible to visit any battlefield in a single day, but the point of these podcasts is to give you an insight as to potentially what there is to see on the ground and give you a way into that battlefield so you can explore it further. And in many cases, as there is with this one, there are other podcasts that you can turn to for further information and further inspiration of what to see beyond the areas that we cover in this episode. So where are we for this battlefield in a day? We're in northern France and we're at the city of Arras. The battlefields around Arras of 1917 and 1918 are some of the key battlefields of the First World War, but yet you could argue that they are a forgotten battlefield of that war, sandwiched between the more popular locations in terms of visitors today, with Flanders to the north and the Somme to the south. Arras doesn't get as much of a look in when it should be. It's only an hour from the Channel port, so very easy to get to, and there is a huge amount of history to cover here. Now, as we've just said, we can't possibly cover the whole Arras battlefield in a day, and I will say immediately, one of the things that we're not going to cover in this episode is Vimy Ridge. The attack by the Canadian Corps on Vimy Ridge on the 9th of April 1917 was part of the Battle of Arras, but it is really deserving of its own Battlefield in a Day episode, and we will cover that in a future podcast. And indeed, if anyone comes to Arras, very often it is because of Vimy Ridge. It's Vimy Ridge that they've come to see, but there is so much more. So why is Arras a forgotten battlefield? I suppose it's difficult to say, really. For many, many years, and this is something we'll cover when we look at sources and things you can turn to gather further information. There were very few books on the Battle of Arras. There were very few guidebooks. That has changed now. And it's a very rewarding battlefield to explore, because while there's been some development around Arras in the same way there has up at Ypres, for example, once you get out into the fields and the villages where the fighting took place in 1917-18, you can find much of the ground pretty much unchanged in terms of the geography, and it's very remote, some of it, so you can feel that you've almost got the landscape to yourself. And like the Somme, it's very similar terrain to the Somme with rolling chalk downland. There are these vast landscapes, vast skies, and it's quite an inspirational battlefield to visit in that respect. The modern world crisscrosses it with motorways, with wind farms, with industrial complexes, but I think that trying to see what took place at Arras in those 2 key years of the war, 2 final years of the war, gives us an insight into the wider history of the Great War. So in terms of Arras and its history in the First World War, it was a French sector from the very beginning of the conflict up to 1916. The French fought the Germans around the city of Arras in 1914, and the Germans captured some of the high ground to the north at Notre-Dame-de-Lorette and Vimy Ridge, and the high ground to the east of the city of Arras. And in 1915, the French, in the battles of Artois, tried to push the Germans off of that high ground. They did so at Notre-Dame-de-Lorette. They failed to do so, despite having got up onto the crest of Vimy Ridge, or Hill 145 as they called it, on several occasions. It remained firmly in German hands. The ground to the east and southeast of Arras saw some minor operations, but following the Battle of Loos in September of 1915, with a new commander-in-chief, Sir Douglas Haig, a decision was made to extend the British line further south, and British troops began to take over the sector around Arras in early 1916. So for half of the war, this was part of the British front, an important part of the British front. Before the fighting at Arras in 1917-18, it was one of these nursery sectors, quiet sectors, where you could bring in units fresh from training in Britain and put them into the front line, or use it as a place for tired divisions having fought on the Somme in 1916 to come up to Arras for a rest, perhaps before moving to another sector of the front. And through the years of 1916, 17 and 18, probably a very high proportion of the British soldiers that fought on the Western Front came to Arras at some point. So to the veterans of the Great War, the men who survived, Arras was a place as familiar to them as Ypres in Flanders or Albert on the Somme, or in indeed any other key location on the British front. So when the British took over the Arras sector, there were no major battles taking place here, and there were none planned for 1916. That was the year of the Battle of the Somme. But there were operations around Arras involving British troops. It was a chalk landscape, so tunnellers of the Royal Engineers could come up and carry out their underground war, as they did just east of Arras at places like Roquelincourt, for example, and also up on Vimy Ridge. When you visit Vimy Ridge today, the craters are there from those 1916 operations. There were trench raids, there were minor operations. The enemy, the Germans, raided the British lines, with the British having taken over the front. It was common practice for the other side, the Germans in this case, to raid the enemy positions to gather information as to who their opponents were. So there was that type of small-scale stuff going on and the day-to-day activities of trench warfare, but it was a static front. Now, at the end of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, plans were being made for a spring offensive the following year, and that would become the Battle of Arras that was fought here from the 9th of April 1917 through to the middle of May. It was quite a short battle, but it was a costly one. And what it proved, probably for many of the veterans, and indeed some of those that I interviewed who took part in the Battle of Arras, for them it was almost like a continuation of the Somme. It wasn't very far from the Somme battlefields. It was a very similar landscape, but it was not as churned up as the landscape of the Somme had become by the end of 1916. And what Arras proved in April and May of 1917 is that the British and Commonwealth forces had learnt lessons from operations on the Somme the previous year. They'd learnt lessons in terms of the implementation of artillery, particularly heavy guns to smash key objectives, and the more successful cutting of wire using shrapnel. They'd learnt how to utilise tanks more, although at Arras there would be great problems with tanks, particularly at locations like Bullecourt. And one of the things that you see in terms of the infantry employed on the battlefield at Arras is the use of the leapfrogging system, where on the Somme perhaps you might get one battalion to take all three objectives in front of it. Now you'd use an entire brigade of 4 battalions, with one taking the first objective, one leaping through that to take the second, another one leaping through those 2 to take the third, and the 4th battalion would be in reserve in case the enemy counterattacked. And what this meant is that one tired, depleted battalion didn't have to try and capture everything. So lessons were being learned, but we always have to be mindful that these lessons were paid for with the price of the lives of good men. Arras was a joint offensive with the French. The French attacked on the Chemin des Dames near Reims. That's a story for another day. But in many respects, the failed outcome of the French attack that cost such terrible casualties to the French army on the Chemin des Dames in April 1917 meant that Arras became a slogging match. Its early successes, with most of the objectives captured in the early phase of the battle, it turned it into a typical attritional battle of the First World War. And by its close, there'd been 159,000 casualties here, killed, wounded and missing on the British and Commonwealth side. Now that's nowhere near as many as nearly 500,000 casualties on the Somme in 1916, or the terrible casualties at Third Ypres in 1917, later on in that year. But when we analyse the daily casualty rates, we see that Arras was just over 4,000 British and Commonwealth casualties a day. Now on the Somme, excepting the 1st of July, it was something like 2,943, and at Third Ypres it was 2,323. So 2 battles that we would see as the deadliest battles of the Great War, the Somme and Passchendaele, actually the casualty rate at Arras was much higher. It was one of Britain's most deadliest battles of the First World War. But it came to an end in the middle of May of 1917 when the line pushed forward. Major parts of the Hindenburg line had been breached, but there'd not been a breakout battle. The line stabilised. There was minor operations around Arras in the summer of 1917 Some units, like the 12th Eastern Division, became very much an Arras division and served here for most of that period. We mentioned them in a previous podcast when we looked at Foichy Chapel and the fighting around there at the opening phase of the battle. And for much of the rest of that year of 1917, eyes turned to Flanders with the fighting at Messines and then the Third Battle of Ypres. But fighting returned to Arras in the spring of 1918 with the German offensive. They broke through on the Somme on the 21st of March, and then a week later there was very heavy fighting around Arras when the Germans attempted to break through there. But although some ground was given up, the village of Monchy-le-Preux just to the east of Arras, for example, the ground around Arras held. With the occupation of Vimy Ridge, that was a topographical feature that dominated that part of the landscape, the Germans were unable to break through on the Arras front, and Arras held. There was a period of stagnation once more, and then in August of 1918, the Canadian Corps moved up from the Somme with British troops on its flanks and made an attack on the German Hindenburg line once more, and through the German defences east of Arras to beyond the Drocourt-Quéant switch line, the Canadians broke through there en route to their battles around Cambrai in late September on into early October of 1918. By the autumn of 1918, Arras was behind the front. It was still a major rail hub for troops and supplies and equipment and everything else, but it had seen in 4 years of fighting some of the toughest battles and costliest battles of the First World War. And surrounding it today are over 200 British and Commonwealth cemeteries maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, but cemeteries of many other nations as well. French from the fighting in 1914 and 15, and indeed some sizable German cemeteries covering the whole war. So that's some backgrounds to the battle itself, and I'm going to put some maps onto the podcast website so you can see the topography of the Arras battlefield and use them on your travels or to follow the routes at home. There'll also be a Google map following the exact route that we'll travel during the course of the day's visits. But just to finish this section, let's look at some books connected to the Battle of Arras in 1917. There is, of course, the British official history that tells the story, the official story of the British Expeditionary Force's role in the fighting here at Arras in 1917. That's the 1917 Volume 1. It's been reprinted. Naval and Military Press sell that. But that's a bit of a dry official account. After that, nothing was really published until the 1990s with Jonathan Nichols' Cheerful Sacrifice. John interviewed hundreds of Great War veterans for the book, and it remains, in my mind, one of the best books on the Battle of Arras. It's really worth reading to get the whole context of the battle and to hear some of those personal stories. A book that I'm pleased to say is still very much in print. And we'll put details of these books onto the podcast website. More recently, there's been Jeremy Banning and Peter Barton's Arras 1917, which is a big landscape book with panoramas, the panoramas that they're famous for explaining and publishing over quite a few different books on aspects of the First World War. It's a big, heavy book, but it's a fantastic book and highly recommended. And Jim Smithson has written a volume about the early stage of the Battle of Arras as well. So in terms of the historiography, the development of publications about the Battle of Arras has moved forward a bit, but still it's not covered in any kind of way compared to the Somme or Ypres. In terms of guidebooks to get you round these battlefields, there's a chapter in Rose Coombs' Before Endeavours Fade. There's my own Walking Arras that I published in 2007 on the 90th anniversary of the Battle of Arras that gets you onto the ground and walking it. And more recently, again, Jim Smithson has published the first in a series of guidebooks to the Arras area, and the late John Cooksey and Jerry Merland have 2 volumes covering Arras. So again, there's more now in print to get you on the ground, to understand the ground and guide you round it. So we've set the scene, we've looked at some potential sources. It's now time to get out on the ground itself and begin our Arras in a day. We'll start our Arras in a day battlefield visits in Arras itself at the Arras Memorial. Now there's 2 parts to this visit, the morning visits and the afternoon visits, and there are 2 separate maps that you can follow on the podcast website. So we're standing outside the Arras Memorial to the Missing on the southwestern side of the city of Arras. This is one of the major memorials to the missing from the British and Commonwealth forces of the Great War. It commemorates more than 35,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who fell at Arras from 1916, when we first took over, up until the end of the war, who have no known grave. There are men from the Royal Naval Division on here, almost every regiment of the British Army, and the Commonwealth forces in this case are from South Africa, the men of the South African Brigade who fought here as part of the 9th Scottish Division in the opening phase of the battle. It's a memorial designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens, one of the principal architects of the Imperial War Graves Commission, and when we look at the casualties that are commemorated here, it's dominated by two periods of the war: the fighting around Arras in April and May of 1917, and then March of 1918. The boundary of the memorial extends south towards the Somme, so the men killed in that March 1918 period cover a bigger geographical area than those who fell in the April-May 1917 battles, for example. There's a separate section for the Royal Flying Corps, the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Air Force, the Air Services Memorial that commemorates nearly 1,000 men who flew in combat over the Western Front and have no known grave. That includes some of the great aces of the First World War, like Lano Hawker and Edward McMannock. And Arras itself in April 1917 was a period known as Bloody April for the flying services, when the Germans had got the upper hand in aircraft technology and were able to shoot down British aircraft on not just a daily basis but almost on an hourly basis in the front over Arras. And many of those Bloody April casualties are commemorated on the panels of the separate Air Forces Memorial here. One of the things when you begin to research men who died at the Battle of Arras in April and May of 1917 is you discover that a very, very high proportion of them have no known grave. And that's particularly true of one of the attacks on the 3rd of May 1917, when I would guess that possibly as many as 80% of the dead are commemorated here on the Arras Memorial. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. Arras was very heavily fought over in 1917 and then again twice in 1918. But when I was researching my Walk in Arras book, I discovered in the archives quite a lot of the units had operation orders where the men were told to remove their pay books and their identity discs before they went into action. So that meant that when they went over the top, there was nothing on them to say who they were. And that could be a contributing factor as to why there's a greater proportion of missing for Arras compared to some of the other battlefields of the Great War. There are 13 Victoria Cross recipients on the memorial from some key battles in those final 2 years of the war, and it includes, for example, 2nd Lieutenant Jack Harrison of the 11th East Yorkshire Regiment, the Hull Pals. He was a Hull teacher and local rugby player and killed with the Pals at Oppy Wood on the 3rd of May 1917, for which he was awarded his bravery that day a posthumous Victoria Cross. We covered that story in another episode of the podcast about the Oppy area. Also commemorated on here, who's killed to the south of Arras, is Walter Tull. He was Britain's first professional black footballer and one of the first black officers in the British Army. He served originally as a sergeant with the 17th Middlesex, the football battalion, was shell-shocked with them on the Somme in 1916, applied for a commission, and then returned to the front with the 23rd Middlesex, the other football battalion, and served with them in Italy, then back in France for the spring of 1918 and was killed in action on the 25th of March during the fighting close to the town of Bapaume. As with every memorial to the missing, there are so many stories, and these two, Jack Harrison and Walter Tull, are amongst the better-known characters commemorated here on the Arras Memorial. But one I always come to have a look at every time I visit this site with a leisure group or on my own is William Hubbard, Bill Hubbard. He served with the 8th Battalion, the Royal Fusiliers, and was killed in action on the 3rd of May 1917 between Monchy-le-Preux and Pelves. He was friends with a Great War veteran that I knew, Alf Rosell. Alf's story is told in John Nichols' book, and it was thanks to John that I got to meet Alf. He came down to our Sussex Western Front branch when I was the chairman there, and Alf gave us a talk that went on for well over 2 hours about his experiences in the Great War. But I had a chance to visit him on many occasions as well. Incredible character, almost total recall of the Great War. And he was captured on the 3rd of May 1917, And as he was being led off by the Germans, he saw the wounded Bill Hubbard lying in a shell hole. Now, he could see by the nature of his wounds that Bill was not going to recover. He did as much as he could. He tried to encourage the Germans to get a stretcher up for him, but they could see that his chances of survival were slim and they wouldn't do that. So Alf, as a prisoner, had no power to insist upon this and was led off by the Germans, promising Bill he'd send someone back if he could. No one could return, sadly, for Bill, and his wounds were so serious that he most likely died of them. His body was never recovered, and his name is here on the Arras Memorial. But that incident at Arras in 1917 haunted Alf Rosell for the rest of his life. He always felt that he should have done more, if he could have done more, to go back and help Bill Hubbard. But under the circumstances, that was always going to be impossible. But nevertheless, it haunted him. And he never really came to terms with it, he said, until he had a chance, thanks to John Nichols, to go back to Arras and stand there at the Arras Memorial and see Bill Hubbard's name on the panels. And somehow that part of his life, not closed, but he came to terms with it. He could see Bill's name. He wasn't lost completely. He was commemorated there. And I think it is the power of memorials to the missing like this, and how they affected veterans who returned like Alf to see comrades' names, and what it must have been like for the families who saw the names of loved ones we can only but imagine. Walking through the corridors of the Arras Memorial, it always strikes me as it gives the impression of being some ancient temple. We walked down the steps into the associated cemetery. Now, this is the Faubourg d'Amiens cemetery. It was a cemetery begun by the British when we took over this sector in 1916. It's roughly in date order, so if you come down from near the Air Services Memorial, you're coming into the latter part of the cemetery where the Canadians are buried from 1918, and right down the far end from there is where the earlier burials from 1916 onwards are. There are now 2,395 British burials here, 152 Canadians, 60 South Africans, 26 New Zealanders, 9 Indians, 6 men of the British West Indies Regiment, 1 Newfoundlander, 1 French grave, 1 Russian, 28 Germans, and 10 unnamed graves and 2 special memorials. So it's quite a diverse cemetery, and one of the things that you look at very quickly there's only 10 unnamed burials, so the vast majority are known soldiers, so we know who they are. So it's a really important Arras cemetery because of that, because it gives us an insight into the units that came here during the Great War and the type of men that came here as well, and the backgrounds that they came from, and the jobs and the stories that connect them to different parts of the battlefield. Now, one nationality in that list that might have made you curious is Russian. There's 1 Russian grave here. Now, this was an Imperial Russian soldier who'd been captured on the Eastern Front by the Germans, and were then being utilised by the Germans against the conventions of the time as forced labour to build the Hindenburg Line, this system of defences that ran from Arras across to Soissons. And he and a comrade managed to escape their German captors, got through their trench system somehow, got out into no man's land, and in February 1917, in posts that were being held by the 7th Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment, they were spotted coming across no man's land. A challenge was made in English. A reply came back which the challenger thought was German but would have been Russian, and he thought they were the enemy, so he opened fire with his Lewis gun, killed 1 man and wounded the other. And it was sadly too late by the time they realised who they were. So the wounded Russian soldier was taken off for treatment, and the other was buried here. And he has a very distinct headstone with the kind of bulbous shape of a typical Russian Orthodox church spire, for example. So he's quite easy to spot if you walk towards the back of the cemetery. He's over on the left-hand side. Again, there are so many stories in this cemetery. We could spend an entire podcast talking about the men who are buried here. But there's a few that I always come and have a look at. In one part of the cemetery are 2 officers of the 7th Royal Sussex buried side by side, Gilbert Nargle and Alfred John Sansom. Gilbert Nargle was the adjutant of the 7th Royal Sussex, and Sansom was the commanding officer. He'd originally served with the 5th Cinque Ports Battalion earlier in the war, and he'd been at the front since early 1915. He was 56 years old, so quite an older man to be serving in the front line. He was headmaster of a school in Hastings, and he'd applied to return home. And in fact, on the day that he died, there was a letter in his pocket from the War Office giving him permission to relinquish his command on the battlefield and finally come home to resume his duties as headmaster. The two of them fought through some of the key battles of that earlier period of the war. Nargle was awarded the Military Cross for his bravery. He was an Anglo-Irishman, and on the 5th of July 1917, they were occupying a captured German dugout near Infantry Hill at Monchy-le-Preux, just east of Arras, watching the star shells and the flares light up the landscape when a single German shell pitched out the darkness, went straight down onto the dugout steps where they stood and killed them instantaneously. Sansom, who should have been sent home to educate young minds, and Gilbert Nargle, with a bright future ahead of him, their war, their lives came to an end here, and they're buried side by side in this cemetery. And not far away from where they're buried is a plot of men who were executed by firing squad, were shot at dawn. Now, we've covered the subject of shot at dawn in a previous episode of the podcast, but although this sounds like a visit connected to the 7th Royal Sussex again, there is a connection to that battalion here with one of the executed soldiers, because John Edward Barnes is buried here. He was one of 3 men in the regiment executed by firing squad in the Great War. He was from Littlehampton on the Sussex coast, and he was shot on the 4th of July 1917, the day before Sansom and Nargle were killed. He had been a persistent offender, he'd deserted before, and when he came up for Field General Court-Martial, having been convicted of that crime before, he stood very little chance of being given a prison sentence this time. It meant the firing squad. But the interesting aspect of Barnes' story, at least for me, is how he's commemorated. He's commemorated here, obviously, on the headstone in this cemetery. But his mother, who would have been aware of his fate, having received that communication from the War Office, just after the war, a local priest in Littlehampton came round and knocked on the door of everybody in the town to ascertain details of any families who had lost someone in the Great War. And he knocked on the door and said, "Did you have someone who died in the Great War?" And Mrs. Barnes replied yes, and gave up the details of her son. She didn't give any further details, the exact circumstances of his death, but her decision to do that in this case enabled him then to be commemorated by name on the Littlehampton War Memorial. Now, there was very few men from the town who served in this particular battalion, so probably they weren't aware of the fates of Private Barnes. There was no one to challenge the commemoration of him. In other parts of Sussex, there was. So one man from East Grinstead, for example, who was executed, his name is not on the local war memorial. And this is not, of course, to condemn Mrs. Barnes in any way. I think it's just an interesting insight into how some families had to try and cope with the loss of someone in this way. When the whole of the community around you is commemorating the dead, how do you commemorate them? You're not going to get any medals, you're not going to get a memorial plaque or scroll, everyone else is. And when it comes to the building of a war memorial, if people had known that Private Barnes was executed, he may not have been included. So I think it's an interesting and useful insight into loss, into a different kind of loss. This is not the glorious dead in this case. This is someone who, as a soldier, had failed and had been executed by the army. But it's good when we stand there now knowing that in terms of the official view and the Royal British Legion view, these men are as much victims of the Great War as those who were killed, wounded, died of wounds, died of sickness, whatever, and that's just as it should be. They're an important part of our understanding of this subject. So leaving the Arras Memorial, we'll get on to the ring road that surrounds the city itself, and we'll head up towards the northeastern part of the battlefield. Now, travelling through Arras, what we see is that there are a lot of original buildings here that predate the First World War. There's the Arras Citadel, the old fortifications that was used by the British Army, and there are many houses and villas and other structures within the city that were there during the Great War. And what you'll see if you look carefully is evidence of the war with impact marks on the buildings. And you'll see upper sections either completely replaced or repaired. So it's a big contrast to visiting somewhere like Ypres, where absolutely nothing survived the Great War. Here at Arras, a lot of the buildings did. From here we'll continue out of Arras on the fast road going northeast up towards the village of Ecure, and then we'll turn off to go towards Rocklincourt. Rocklincourt was on the northern edge of the British attack. This is where our lines join with the Canadians. The Canadian assault on Vimy Ridge was just north of here, and from Rocklincourt around Arras down towards the village of Bullecourt, this was the main British sector, with the Australians to the south at Bullecourt and the Canadians to the north at Vimy, as we've said. Around Rocklincourt there's a number of battlefield cemeteries connected to the fighting in 1917. There's Highland Cemetery out in the fields and Rocklincourt Valley Cemetery close by. Highland is just over 300 burials and Rocklincourt Valley just over 500. And these are men who were killed in the two northernmost British divisions that assaulted here, the 51st Highland Division and the 34th Division. They attacked this ground around Rocklincourt and down towards the position known as the Point de Jour. And these are not untypical of some of the Arras cemeteries, and they relate not just to the ground and the fighting on this ground, but the units that took part in that fighting. So it gives them quite a comrade's character when you go there, and you see in this case ranks and ranks of different Scottish regiments that were part of the Highland Division. We then travel down past Rocklincourt towards the road that runs from Arras up towards the village of Balliol, and we come down past the Rocklincourt aerodrome. And I always think of John Giles when I go past here, because in the 80s he flew across the Western Front and photographed it for the Western Front Association, of which he was then the chairman, and he used this airport quite a lot as part of his journeys in photographing the front. And you'll see out in the fields close by the remnants of a German bunker, and this was also an area where there was quite a lot of mining activity before the Battle of Arras in 1917, and when I first used to come here there were quite a lot of craters in some of the clumps of trees in this area. But we'll continue up along the D919 and we'll turn off and go down to a wooded area where we'll find a German cemetery. This is the German cemetery at Saint-Laurent-Blangy. It was created in 1921-22 from German cemeteries that were located around the Arras battlefield. In the villages that were behind the German front in 1917, almost all of them had some kind of German cemetery within them. So the ones that were found there were then closed and moved into sites like this. It's a bit of a forgotten German cemetery. A lot of the visitors who come to Arras go to the massive German cemetery at La Targette, that has over 44,000 burials in it. But this is not a small cemetery. There's 31,939 burials here. Over 7,000 of them in individual graves, 22,000 of the burials unknown, and it includes just over 12,000 in one Kameradengraben, one comrades or mass grave within the cemetery. It's very much an Arras cemetery for the Germans, and it covers the German units that fought in this area. Sadly, those units are not indicated on the graves, but given the areas where we know some of these graves were brought in from, it must cover the plethora of different German units and divisions that served on this part of the front in the key battles of those last 2 years of the war. Some German cemeteries from much further afield were also moved here in the 50s when the Germans concentrated their dead in northern France, as they did in other parts of the Western Front battlefields. They brought men from as far away as Comines up on the border with Belgium to be buried here, for example. But the bulk of the burials that are in here do appear to be from the fighting around Arras, particularly in 1917 and 18. And it's always important on any trip to the battlefields to come and visit a German cemetery to see and respect and remember the other side. And in vast German cemeteries like this one, get an insight into the sheer scale of the First World War. There's a British cemetery close by, which is Balliol Road East Cemetery, which is just over 1,000 burials. There are quite a few men from the Royal Naval Division buried in there, and the war poet Isaac Rosenberg, who was killed with the 1st Battalion, the King's Own Royal Lancaster Regiment, on the 1st of April 1918. There's been some more recent research indicating that this may not actually be his burial site, but Isaac Rosenberg, one of the atypical poets of the Great War, a working-class Jewish lad, not a middle-class, well-educated lad, his insight into the war through his poems nevertheless is a formidable one, and he certainly ranks amongst those important poets of the Great War. We'll then continue along the road here into the village of Balliol To our left, to the north, we're looking up towards the lower slopes of Vimy Ridge where the Canadians were. We're going to turn off and go through the village and then take a minor road going east towards the next village of Oppy. That'll take us out onto the battlefield near Oppy Wood. As we've mentioned, we've covered this area in a previous podcast in some greater detail, but it's very flat, the landscape here, and as you approach Oppy Wood, which was the objective of the Hull powers who attacked here on the 3rd of May 1917, you can see the attacking ground. This big open landscape devoid of cover was potentially very difficult for them, particularly as they advanced with the moon behind them, and it's not surprising they suffered such heavy casualties here. Second Lieutenant Jack Harrison, who we mentioned, whose name is on the Arras Memorial, this is where he was killed in the fighting for Oppy Wood, and his body was never found. Coming up to where the road meets the corner of the wood, there is a new little memorial there, a private memorial really to the Hull battalions. But if we go into the village and turn right up towards the church, the Kingston upon Hull Memorial is here, that was dedicated in the 1920s when people from Hull came over. A casket of earth was taken from Oppy Wood and was placed in the Hull cenotaph. And this memorial doesn't just commemorate the men from Hull who died at Oppy Wood, it commemorates all of those from Hull who died in the Great War, whether on land or at sea or in the air. Oppy was very much a POW sector. Post the Battle of Arras, the 31st Division that included all these different POWs battalions from Barnsley and Bradford and Accrington, Hull of course, but also Sheffield and Leeds. They served in this sector for quite some months and occupied the ground between here and the next village. And we'll follow that road that now takes us past a massive electrical substation, which is very close to where the front lines were post the Battle of Arras, up into the edge of the next village of Gavrel. And just before we get to where the motorway passes over this road on a bridge, we're close to the site of the Gavrel windmill, where the Royal Marine battalions of the Royal Naval Division fought here in April of 1917. As we come into the village of Gavrel, we head over to the western side of it towards Arras, where there is a more modern memorial to the men of the Royal Naval Division. It's a broken wall with an anchor in the middle of it and the badges of the different regiments that fought with the Royal Naval Division. Now this memorial is not to everyone's taste, and it's looking a little bit decrepit now, if I'm honest with you. The last time I came here, just before COVID, it was looking in need of some renovation, and it was placed here in the 90s by a chap called Trevor Tasker and a group of others who wanted to commemorate the important role of the Royal Naval Division in the fighting here in 1917. Well, who were the RND as they were known? Well, the Royal Naval Division came into existence following an idea of Winston Churchill in 1914, who was Lord of the Admiralty, when he realised there were more sailors than ships to put them on, and he decided to form an infantry unit of naval personnel. Each of the different naval units named after a famous admiral, Nelson of course, but Benbow, Collingwood, Hood and so on, and then Royal Marines from the Royal Marine Light Infantry from Portsmouth, Plymouth, Chatham and Deal, and they served at Antwerp in 1914, Gallipoli in 1915, and then the Western Front from 1916 until the end of the war. Their official memorial is at Beaucourt on the Somme. We've mentioned that in a previous podcast, but this battle was kind of forgotten, and I think Trevor Tasker and the others wanted to remember it here. But even if you don't particularly like this memorial, out in the fields opposite it is Naval Trench Cemetery, named after the Royal Naval Division. And if you go back into Gavrel itself to the church, and not a lot of people realise that this is here, inside the church is an original wooden battlefield cross that commemorates the men of the Hood Battalion who fell in this area, and it was placed there by the old comrades of that unit and kept on the battlefield where those men had fought and died in 1917. In March 1918, the village was attacked during the German offensive here, and troops from the 56th London Division, London Territorials, fought in defence of this ground. And the town hall has a memorial on it to the men of the Queen's Westminster Rifles, the 16th Battalion of the London Regiment, who fought in the action here on the 28th of March 1918. So it shows in villages like this how the crisscross chronology of the Great War weaves its way through these different locations. Now, from Gavrel you can take the fast road back towards Arras, go up over the Point de Jour, which was the highest point here where the men of the 9th Scottish Division, commanded by a South African general, General Lukin, who had commanded the South African Brigade at Delville Wood the previous year, and he was now commanding the 9th Scottish Division. His men advanced some great distance over this ground in April of 1917, and you can come off and go to the Point de Jour cemetery close by, which is the memorial cairn to the 9th Scottish Division. This was originally on the very crest of the Point de Jour, but it was moved in the early 2000s because of its position straddling two fast roads, and it made it impossible to get to, so it was moved to here. Then you can resume your journey down to the village of Fampu, and we're going to go north out of the village up towards the Sunken Lane. As we come out of Fampu into the farmland beyond, we're coming into those vast open landscapes that we find here at Arras, and ahead of us the road branches off and we can see the beginning of the Sunken Lane and a grey stone memorial to the men of the Seaforth Highlanders. This commemorates the regiment as a whole, but in particular their 2nd Battalion that fought here in April 1917. It made an attack here with another battalion on the 11th of April from this Sunken Lane over the open ground down into the neighbouring village of Ruex, and the fighting that followed resulted in the award of a posthumous Victoria Cross to David McIntosh, who is buried in a cemetery just on the far side of Fampu. It was a tragic attack in many respects with heavy losses. The battalion went in very much under strength, well under 500 officers and men, and suffered well over 70% casualties in the advance over this open ground. It seems incredible that a battalion could be sent forward in broad daylight under those circumstances, but it was. So while the Battle of Arras had gone well in its early stages, very often it broke down into these typical attritional battles of the like that we see here. The Sunken Lane was captured on the 9th of April 1917 by men of the 4th Division. They had leapfrogged through Lukin's Scottish troops and moved up to this position. The Rifle Brigade captured this ground, and it was one of the other incidents in the war in which footballs appeared. It's said that they drop-kicked a football into the German redoubt here prior to its capture. When I come here, though, I always think of George Butler. He's a veteran that I've mentioned quite a lot of times in this podcast. He served with the Lancashire Fusiliers in the Machine Gun Corps, and his machine gun section were out in the forward zone of the battlefield here on the 9th of April 1917 with his Vickers gun set up on the lip of a shell hole. He was the number one on the gun, armed with a revolver, and his team was around him. And in the darkness a group of men were coming towards them, which at first they thought were Germans, but actually they were British officers. And this is the occasion in which he met Brigadier General Adrian Carton-de-Wiart, VC, who was one of the officers in this party that dropped down into his shell hole. Carton-de-Wiart was a regular soldier. He'd gone from a trooper in the Boer War through to a brigadier general in 1917. He was an old school soldier in so many ways, and he looked at George Butler, who was a regular soldier who joined as a boy soldier before the war, and George very rarely wore his steel helmet, something that cost him in 1918 when he was wounded in the head by a shell burst. But he was wearing his service cap, but he'd not taken the stiffener out of it because that was something that a lot of wartime recruits did. He thought that that was sloppy, so he kept his stiffener in as he was a regular soldier. And de Wiart saw this and recognised it for what it was, and he said to him, "Regular soldier, are you, Sergeant?" And George Butler replied, "Yes, sir." And de Wiart then said, "Well, jolly good show, Sergeant. When this war's over, we'll get back to real soldiering." The officer group then left, and George and his machine gunners were there in the darkness, not really knowing where the enemy was. And the Battle of Arras had reached its first evening, the end of its first day. There's a Sunken Lane cemetery here, which has some of the dead from the more static period of trench warfare that followed the Battle of Arras, but we'll return to Fampu, follow the road over the motorway into the next village, which is that village of Ruex that the men of the Seaforth Highlanders were attacking in April of 1917. This was a reasonably large village. It was dominated by a railway station and the railway line to the north, and a big chemical factory, the chemical works, as it's often described as. Now, this was probably an agricultural chemical works, making fertiliser, I would guess, rather than a big chemical factory, but it dominated this part of the village. There's no trace of it at all now. It's where there's a supermarket just south of the railway station. When I first came here in the 1980s with my dad, The rubble of the original chemical works and the shell holes and the detritus of war was still very, very visible, and there was sheep grazing on it, but that was then demolished and a tennis court and a supermarket was put in its place. I'll leave you to decide whether that was progress or not. But the chemical works was a key feature in the fighting here because the Germans defended it and attack after attack came through here. There were a lot of concrete bunkers around the village, one of which is very close by down a side street, quite a large concrete structure. And again, when I first came here, that was open up. You could go inside and even descend down into the tunnel system below if you were that daring. That's all sealed up now, but the tunnels beneath this village were greatly utilised by the Germans, and there was attacks involving different units that fought here at different stages, which overrun the German positions, only for the Germans to pop up behind them, utilising these tunnels, and the fighting continued. And it really became one of the great killing grounds, really, I think, of Arras, the ground around Ruex and the ground around the chemical or the comical works, as some of the soldiers called it. One of my other old vets who lived in the same retirement home as George Butler was a chap called Frank Plum. He originally joined the Suffolk Cyclist Battalion, then was transferred as a post First Day of the Somme reinforcement into the 11th Battalion, the Suffolk Regiment, the Cambridgeshire Battalion, and he served with them from the summer of 1916 up until he was really badly wounded in April of 1918. He was wounded too here at Ruex in the attack on the village. When he got into a German trench and a German threw a stick grenade at him, it landed at his feet, exploded, blew him out of the trench, but he survived. Now, if that had been a Mills hand grenade, he would have been killed instantly. So it shows the difference between the power of a British grenade and a German one. He told me this story, and he paused afterwards, and he looked at me, he said, "I did have children after the war, by the way." And then we moved on to the next subject. As we travel through the village of Ruex down towards the River Scarpe and cross over that, a lot of the battles of Arras were called the Battles of the Scarpe, the first, second and third Battles of the Scarpe, which were the different stages of the fighting here at Arras in 1917. But there used to be, up until the 1990s, a cafe in this village where you could go in and get a drink and omelette and chips, but they had a little entrance to a cave system that was part of the overall cave and tunnel system of Ruex, which you could go into. It was quite a precarious set of steps to go down into it, all chalk lined, and the walls down there were covered in British graffiti of the Great War. A lot of men from the Guards Division, I remember, and also Scottish troops that were there towards the end of the fighting in 1917. It was an amazing time capsule of the First World War, probably not unique in the village, but it was the only one that was then accessible. The cafe then changed hands. It is no longer a cafe, it's a private house. When I lived on the Somme, I went there and tried to persuade them to open it up to visitors, but they were not interested, so sadly it remains closed and inaccessible. Perhaps one day, we can only hope. Having crossed the River Scarpe and coming out of Ruex, we rise up onto the high ground close to the next village, which is the village of Monchy-le-Preux. Now this sits on some of the highest ground east of Arras, dominates the landscape, was in German occupation from 1914 onwards. It was clear that whoever held this ground held the ground immediately around Arras itself, so the Germans dominated it, and it was an objective on the first day of the Battle of Arras. It wasn't reached that day. Across to our right, where we can see the modern motorway that runs from Lille down to Paris, and there's an industrial complex just beyond that, close to a site that was known on British maps as Orange Hill. They got as far as that, but Monchy eluded them. And then another unit, the British 37th Division, came up through them and continued with the advance into Monchy village. It was then captured. There was a cavalry assault here on the far side, close to the Arras-Cambrai road. And with the capture of the village, other units then moved up from another division, the 29th Division in this case. The 1st Battalion, the Essex Regiment, and the Newfoundland Regiment moved up to the ground beyond the village at a position called Infantry Hill, and they defended that and then came under German counterattack. More of that shortly. So Monchy was very much a hub of the fighting here in 1917 because of its commanding position. The British haven't taken it, the Germans wanted it back, and in 1918, in March 1918, the Germans took it back in the German offensive here at that time, and then the Canadians retook it in August of 1918 in the final battles for Arras. Just before we come into the village, over to our left in the big open landscape there towards the next village of Pelve, this is the ground where Alf Rozelle encountered Bill Hubbard in a shell hole, and that incident that led to Alf being marched off as a prisoner of war by the Germans and poor old Bill being left behind. This is where he died. And every time I come up over this rise, I always look to my left, down towards Pelv, and think of Alf, an incredible veteran of the Great War. He's in that Game of Ghosts documentary that I often talk about on the podcast, and I put a link to it a few times in other episodes. This is where him and Bill's story came together in this vast open landscape. These big landscapes, they can feel anonymous at some times, but when you know the story of men like Alf and like Bill who fought here, somehow they come alive. Coming into the village, we turn off to our right, go towards the church, and there we find the Caribou, the Newfoundland Regiment Memorial, sited on top of a British bunker that dates from 1918, a British observation bunker, looking out towards Infantry Hill, where the fighting was. Now, after the capture of the village, the Newfoundlanders and the Essex Regiment moved up to those positions in front of Monchy towards Infantry Hill, and the Germans counter-attacked and overrun their trenches. A large number of Newfoundlanders were taken prisoner, the battalion was pushed back, and the battalion commander, together with officers' servants and cooks and batmen and all these kind of people, got together and held the village until they were relieved. And this resulted in the award of a number of gallantry decorations for bravery here. Not a Victoria Cross, as many felt that there should have been, but nevertheless, it was an important page in the history of the Newfoundland Regiment, and so it was chosen as one of the sites for the Caribou to be placed. Behind it is the village war memorial, where you'll find mention of the Isle of Wight, and they twinned with Monchy after the war to help in the reconstruction of the village. And the war memorial itself is quite a moving one, with a widow and an orphan, and you can see the number of names that are on there for a small village like this. It just gives you an insight into France's devastating loss in the Great War. But there's a new memorial close by commemorating the Essex Yeomanry, who were part of the cavalry attack here on the 11th of April 1917, which went disastrously wrong, and the battlefield in front of Arras, between Arras and Monchy, was full of the bodies of not just the cavalry troopers, but of horses that were cut down by German fire from the high ground around Monchy. Just round the corner is the memorial to the 37th Division, the English Division. This is often called because its battalions came from England rather than Scotland or Wales or Ireland. They were English county regiments, and this unit captured the village in April 1917. It's a fine memorial with bronze Tommies on the top, and it was once flanked by 2 German field guns that were carted off by the Germans for scrap, it is said, in the Second World War. But we'll go through the village out to the far side and up onto Infantry Hill. And I always think this is a good place to come out to. This is the actual battlefield, and this was the front line at Monchy following the Battle of Arras in April and May of 1917. And here we can see beyond towards the ground that wasn't fought over until 1918 and back towards Arras itself. And it's a good point to end our morning's visit. After a picnic on the battlefields or a spot of lunch in Arras, we resume our tour of Arras in a day by beginning this afternoon at the Wellington Quarries. This is just to the south of Arras, not far from the centre, and it was part of the subterranean Arras that existed during the Great War. There were all these medieval tunnels and caves, but they weren't joined up, and when the British took over this sector, they brought up the New Zealand Tunnelling Company of the New Zealand Engineers, and they utilised their skills to join up all these locations to create this underground city for the British Army to use, and that's what it did on the eve and indeed during the entire Battle of Arras in 1917. Now, most of this, understandably, is not open to the public, and where we are here at the Wellington Quarries was once the local camping ground, and they were doing some work on it some years ago, and part of the road had collapsed and this exposed an entrance to it, and eventually they decided to open this up to create an accessible part of the tunnel system for visitors to go into, and that's what the Wellington Quarries is, and it's really worth a visit because it gives you an insight into that underground war. And you can see graffiti on the walls, you can see the steps at exit number 10 where the men of the Suffolk Regiment moved up to make their attack on the ground to the east of Arras. It's a very moving place to go round, and you have excellent local guides there who tell the story of what happened beneath Arras in 1917. And when you think this is just one system, it gives you an idea just how big that subterranean world was beneath the city of Arras. Leaving the quarries, we take a little side route that takes us back up onto the main Arras-Cambrai road, and we come into a section of Rue de Temple, and at the end, almost at the end on the right-hand side, is a red brick house that incredibly survived the Great War, and if you stop and look at it, you'll see signs painted on it in a bitumen paint that has survived even more than 100 years. The DCLI you can see painted on the side of it, Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, and signs indicating that it was used as a barber's for soldiers to get their hair cut. So it's a really important bit of Great War archaeology, really, that has survived all those years. Then coming up onto the main road, we head east, and this old Roman road takes us right through the middle of the Arras battlefields. And here we turn off and go through the village of Tilloy and follow a local road that takes us across to the next village of Wancourt. Now, this follows the routes of the British attack in April of 1917, having broken through the outlying defences around villages like Tilloy. They were then moving on into the next phase of the Hindenburg Line defences here, these static defences built by the Germans during that winter of 1916-17. And out in the fields, you'll see the occasional German bunker. A lot of the bunkers as part of the defences here were below ground level, so if there's a bit of LiDAR done here where you can investigate the ground and kind of see a snapshot of what lies beneath, you'd see a lot more of these concrete structures, I suspect. And you'll also come across battlefield cemeteries here that mark the points at which the advance took place. On this route, for example, we go past Tigris Lane and Hyber's Trench Cemetery, that one tucked up right by the side of the motorway, an unusual cemetery built on a kind of curved bit of ground on which the headstones follow the contour of where the cemetery is placed. And both of these have units connected to actions on the ground over which we've just travelled. The 7th Battalion King's Royal Rifle Corps, for example, have some of their dead here, and they took part in an attack on the village of Wancourt that was highly criticised in their war diary, that accused the staff who planned it really of just throwing men's lives away because it ended in disaster with heavy losses. And this was written in a contemporary war diary by the adjutant of that unit, which is quite an unusual thing for you to see in a war diary, a junior officer criticising the general staff. But coming into Wancourt, we travel through the village and go up to the fields beyond to Wancourt British Cemetery. This is quite a large one. There's just under 2,000 burials in here, of which 829 are unknown. It's looking over the Wancourt battlefield. We can see some German bunkers close by, and if we took the track to the left of the cemetery and up onto the rise, we come up onto a position known as Wancourt Tower on the British trench maps. There was the remains of a tower, stone tower up there. And when I first used to come here, the remains of it was still here, but it's pretty much gone now. This is a part of the battlefield that connects us to quite a few different books of the Great War. Across to our left, towards the village of Jemappe, that's where Sir John Bagot Glubb Pasha fought, and his book Into Battle as a Young Engineer Officer describes the fighting here. But there's a less well-known book by Francis Buckley called Q6A and Other Stories. Buckley was an officer in the Northumberland Fusiliers in the 50th Northumbrian Division, and this became part of their key Arras sector in 1917, and his memoirs that were privately published, which have been republished now I think, describe this part of the battlefield in some detail, including some of his sketches of it. And then you can continue along the track that runs beneath the embankment here up towards the next village, and you'll pass Heninel Communal Cemetery Extension just up here, which is again a post-Arras battlefield cemetery to bury the dead that were killed up in the front line beyond, but it gives us quite a good cross-section of the sort of units that were here at that stage. And then we can follow the road up onto the open fields beyond, up onto this area of the Hindenburg Line battlefields in this part of Arras. We're back on one of those big open landscapes. The modern world intrudes on it a little bit. There's a big wind farm up here now, and we can see the A1 motorway to Paris over to our right, and probably hear it in the distance as well. But there are a lot of battlefield cemeteries up here which are really quite interesting to visit, including very many small battlefield cemeteries that normally would have been closed and moved into bigger cemeteries elsewhere, but here they were retained. So Heninel Crossroads Cemetery, which you can drive up to now because the roads were improved for the wind farm, is very much a 33rd Division cemetery. They were a unit that fought in this area in April and May of 1917 and took part in attacks on positions like Tunnel Trench, for example, real in-depth positions on the Hindenburg Line with bunkers and thick belts of wire, deep trenches. And one of those up here with the Royal Welsh Fusilier Battalion of that division was Siegfried Sassoon, the war poet. This is where he was wounded in 1917, and describes that in Memoirs of an Infantry Officer. But beyond up a little sunken lane, there is Cuckoo Passage Cemetery, which is a small battlefield cemetery with some men from the Manchester Powers in it. And I did an episode about Arras in the early stage of the podcast where I mentioned Malcolm Vivian, the gunner officer who I knew, who came from Cornwall. This is where he served with his siege battery, doing his bunker busting of the bunkers on this part of the German Hindenburg Line. And there's quite a few of them out in the fields in this area, including some pretty large ones that are quite interesting to explore. They're on private land, obviously, and you need to respect that, but nevertheless, in the winter in particular, when there's no crops in the field, it doesn't harm to walk out to them and have a look. Malcolm was nearly killed in this sunken lane that's here close to Cuckoo Passage when he was spotting for the guns, and he's signalling. NCO who was with him noticed that the Germans were beginning to shell them, and he was looking over the lip of the lane. The NCO grabbed him, pulled him down just as a shell struck the top of the sunken lane where the embankment was, and if it had still been up there, he'd have been killed instantly. So that was an incident where he almost ran out of luck. You can continue down the road here into the next village of Croisy, which you can see in the distance, and we're coming into ground connected to the film 1917. Again, we did a previous podcast episode about that, the history behind it. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but it gives you a good insight into that pre-Arras period when the Germans had withdrawn to the Hindenburg Line and the British were moving up in response to it. And this is the bit of ground depicted in the film between Croisy and the next village of Écus-Sommières. It also wasn't far from here where Walter Tull was killed in March 1918, and in Croisy British Cemetery there are some graves of men from his battalion killed the same day as him, including quite a few unknowns. Perhaps one of them is him, we'll never know. And as we come into Écus, there's a railway embankment across to our left. There's some British cemeteries, one of which is on the actual embankment itself, and this was just behind the British front line in March of 1918. The Germans broke through here at that point, and one of those that fought on this bit of ground, again a way to connect the landscape to the literature of the Great War. This is where Ernst Junger was in March 1918. He describes the action here around Écus and Bullecourt in Storm of Steel. It's just a small village, Écus, but I think when you've seen 1917, the film, you think of that amazing sequence where he's running through the streets of Écus at night with gunfire and shell fire and the flash of flares and explosions all around him. And I think that is the importance of films like that, because it transports your mind back to what this village potentially would have looked like during the Great War. It's a modern, rebuilt 1920s village. It's a quiet village. The war seems very far away, but having seen a film like that, the remembrance of those powerful sequences, I think, really connects you and helps your understanding of this ground today. But we'll turn off and go up towards the next village of Bullecourt. That'll take us up towards where the main Hindenburg Line was. We're on a join now between British forces. We started near Rocklincourt, where the northern edge of British forces were joining the Canadians, and now we're on the southern edge, where the men of the 62nd West Riding Division, which was a Yorkshire Territorial Division, joined with the Australian forces facing the village of Bullecourt. They didn't attack here on the first day of the battle, but they moved into the attack on the village on the 11th of April, assisted by tanks. And while tanks had been reasonably successfully deployed in other parts of the Arras battlefield, here it went disastrously wrong when almost all of the tanks were destroyed or immobilised, and it put the Australians off tanks for quite some time, really until Monash took over the controlled command of the Australian Corps in 1918, and he got his men training with tanks again and gave them confidence that tanks were potentially war-winning weapons. But here it went disastrously wrong, and while the Australians got a foothold in the Hindenburg Line, this proved a very costly battle for them, and the vast majority of their dead from the fighting here do not have a known grave. They're commemorated not on the Arras Memorial, there's no Australians there, but on their own memorial, the Villers-Bretonneux Memorial on the Somme, that commemorates Australian soldiers who fell in France who have no known grave. Coming into the village, we come to a small museum. It used to be a private museum owned by Jean Leté. He was the former mayor of Bullecourt. Again, we've done a previous episode about Bullecourt, and we spoke about Jean Leté and his wife and the museum that they had here. Both of them sadly now passed away. The Australian government took on Jean's collection and opened this museum. And it's not just a museum to the fighting and the units, both Australian and British, that fought here at Bullecourt in 1917-18. In many ways, it's a memorial to Jean Leté and his wife and the work that they did to promote remembrance and remembrance tourism, and the help that they gave over so many years to the many Australian visitors that came here. Jean was a really kind, decent man. Nothing was too much trouble for him, and he had recovered so much of the history of Bullecourt, including some artefacts from the tanks that were knocked out here in 1917. And in recent years, Richard Osgood, one of the conflict archaeologists that works for the Ministry of Defence in Britain, did a proper organised dig of this ground and uncovered another tank from the fighting during that period. So it just shows again, all of these landscapes, all of these battlefields are still giving up their secrets, and the battlefield conflict archaeology that takes place here is so important in enhancing our understanding of the history of the Great War. But here in this simple little private museum, we see a lot of personal items, a lot of stories of men that fought at Bullecourt, and it's a really interesting museum to come to. One that is not widely well known, I don't think, and is well worth diverting to. Even if you don't come to do Arras in a day, come and have a look at this at some point. We'll continue through the village. There's a memorial to the tanks right by the church, the original Australian memorial that was placed here in the 80s. The Slouch Hat Memorial is in front of the church as well, but we'll go out and we'll branch off to the right down a road, a little side road that takes us to the Digger Memorial, which is a little memorial park in a sunken lane just outside Bullecourt, close to the second phase of the fighting at Bullecourt in 1917 involving the Australian troops. And the Digger statue here that was designed in bronze by Peter Corlett is an amazing bit of bronze sculpture that looks out across the battlefield. In the 90s, just at the back of the memorial, a local farmer was working here and he found the remains of an Australian soldier. Tucked in his pocket was a leather pouch in which was a faded photograph of him with his family, including a young girl, but more importantly, a metal identity disc identified him as Sergeant Jack White, and he'd been killed here on the 3rd of May 1917 with the 22nd Battalion Australian Imperial Force. His name was on the Villers-Bretonneux Memorial, but after all those years he'd finally been found. And the young girl on the photograph was his daughter, who was incredibly still alive, and when Jack White was reburied at Quillan Road Cemetery in October 1995, she came to the ceremony, and I had the pleasure of and the honour of meeting her. And some of Jack White's possessions that were found with him, the family gave to Jean Leté and are on display in the museum that we just come from in Bullecourt. We'll then continue into Hendecourt, and we're going off the area that was fought over in 1917 now. Just beyond the sunken lane where the Digger Memorial is, there's an older memorial to the missing of the Australians at Bullecourt that was placed there by André Coyot from Arras, who had his own private museum there, and John Laffin, the author, the Australian author who wrote so many books on military history, to commemorate the vast majority of the Australian soldiers who fell there who do not have a known grave. But when we go beyond that, we're coming up to the high tide mark of the fighting in 1917 and moving into 1918 territory. As we cross through Hendecourt, the next village, we come up to an area known as the Crow's Nest on the trench maps, and this was where the Canadian Corps was advancing through here in the summer of 1918. The Canadians had fought down on the Somme on the 8th of August, the Black Day of the German Army, had broken through with their Australian colleagues on their flanks, and then the British on the flanks of the Australians, had broken through with the French to the south as well, and pushed the Germans back. The collapse of the line on the Somme saw the Canadians then move up to Arras to continue with the pressure on the Germans, and they attacked the Hindenburg line east of the city of Arras towards the end of August 1918, broke through at Monchy, and pretty much did not stop as they continued towards Cambrai, and that took them through the outer extremities of the Hindenburg line and then into the Drocourt-Quéant switch line. A switch line is a linked-up line of defence which is flexible, which the Germans liked, and it gave them a more elasticated approach to defending it in terms of launching counter-attacks, which was the typical German response to any advance into their territory. The Drocourt-Quéant switch line was a tough battle for the Canadians. It's marked not far from here by a Canadian memorial. The Crow's Nest was part of the German defences in this ground, and there's a new Canadian memorial commemorating that here. And on this landscape, you can follow pretty much the Canadian advance by their battlefield cemeteries, from the burials at Orange Hill, closer to Arras, and then right through this ground with battlefield and comrade cemetery after comrade cemetery, including ones like Upton Wood, and then continue right across to Cambrai, up towards Bourlon Wood, and indeed beyond, which is the direction the Canadian Corps was going at that stage. Continuing, this brings us up back onto the Arras-Cambrai road, and we can see how important this road is by the number of times we've crisscrossed it during the course of this day's visits. We'll turn left here and head into the village of Vis-en-Artois, and what we come to is the Vis-en-Artois British Cemetery and Memorial. The cemetery was started by the Canadian Corps. When you go up the steps into the initial entrance area of the cemetery, you can see rows of Canadian graves that date from August of 1918, and these are the original burials made by Canadian burial units following the advance through here. And then post-war, it was used as a concentration cemetery. There's now 2,369 burials here, of which 1,458 are unidentified, which is not an uncommon percentage in a post-war concentration cemetery like this. There's a few teenage Tommies in here. As you go in, you'll see the graves of Private Alfred Cake of the Newfoundland Regiment, who was killed on the 14th of April 1917 in the fighting at Monchy-le-Preux. He was aged only 16. He was born at Tilt Cove, Newfoundland, on the 13th of April 1901. So he was killed the day after his 16th birthday, and he'd been at the front for a little while. Not far away is the grave of Private Donald Joseph Campbell of the 85th Canadian Infantry. He was killed in the attack on the Drocourt-Quéant switch line on the 2nd of September 1918, aged 17. He was born at Dominion, Nova Scotia, was killed by machine gun fire near the village of Dury, and both of these lads were volunteers. So when we think of teenage Tommies, Richard Van Emden's written about this extensively in his work. His new update on his book, Boy Soldiers of the Great War, really excellent, worth getting. Can't recommend it enough. But it shows with graves like these that it wasn't just in Britain that we find these teenage soldiers. Teenagers more than a century ago, of course, were different to teenagers now. These lads would have considered themselves men, but their lives were so short. To me, that's always the tragedy. They'd hardly begun to live, hardly had a chance to see the world, understand the world, before their lives were cut short here on the battlefields around Arras. The Vis-en-Artois memorial to the rear of the cemetery is a memorial to the missing. It commemorates 9,847 soldiers from Britain and the Commonwealth who died between the 8th of August 1918 and the 11th of November. So it's in the last 100 days, the advance to victory of the Great War. And it commemorates men killed in France in the battles, in the breakout on the Somme, or here in the ground between Arras and Cambrai, but also men killed in Belgium in the final phase of the advance towards Mons. The ones killed in Flanders during that period are commemorated on the Tyne-Cot Memorial. So it's an interesting memorial. It indicates just how heavy the casualties were in those last 100 days of the war. It was designed by J.R. Truelove, one of the lesser-known architects of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, with some of the sculptured features such as George and the Dragon that is in the centrepiece of the memorial. That was done by Ernest Gillick, and it was unveiled on the 4th of August 1930. The names are carved on panels on curved stone walls. Again, it gives this kind of temple-like feeling, these memorials, very often. And as part of the memorial, there are two 70-foot-high towers that almost feel as if they should have beacons in the top of them calling out across this landscape. And as we look at the names that are on here covering that period from Amiens to Mons, it ties in nicely where we began with the panels of the Arras Memorial with the missing of 1917. We've followed it round the Arras battlefields. We've got a sense of the ground here at Arras, the fatal ground here at Arras from those last 2 years of the war. And as always in a day, we can't cover everything, but it gives us an impression of what an important battlefield this is and one worthy of visiting. And in a dark symmetry, we've begun and we've ended with the missing of the Great War. Here somehow the ancient temple-like corridors of the Arras Memorial reach out and connect to the tall towers of Vis-en-Artois. These terrible, costly pathways beyond Arras of 1917 and 18 have left their indelible mark across this landscape, across the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.